morning, everyone, and welcome to Abandoning Average, How to Personalize Learning in the Classroom. My name is Phyllis Lockett, and I'm the CEO of Leap Innovations, which is a nonprofit organization that is focused on connecting innovation and education to transform the way kids learn. We work directly with educators and innovators to discover, pilot, and scale personalized learning practices and innovative technologies in and out of the classroom. At Leap, we have one overarching goal: to unlock the potential of each and every student. And to do that, we need a new paradigm in education, one that harnesses innovation to tailor the needs of each individual learner. Today, we will hear from one of the foremost experts in the science of the individual, Todd Rose, who is the co-founder and president of the Center for Individual Opportunity and faculty member at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where he teaches educational neuroscience. Todd is also the author of Square Peg and the new book, which has become the Bible at Leap, The End of Average: How to Succeed in a World That Values Sameness. Joined with us is Leap's Chief Innovation Officer, Chris Liang-Vergara, who is also a Pahara Institute Next Gen Fellow. Chris is one of the founding team members at Leap and has been instrumental in shaping our core programs, and was also named as one of the top 40 innovators in education in 2013 by the Center for Digital Education. Chris also has over 12 years of education experience in K-12. We're going to first start with Todd, who will share his perspective on personalized learning, and then Chris will share specifics on the new Leap Learning Framework and how we can implement personalized learning practices in your classrooms. And then we'll have a few minutes for questions. So without further ado, let me present Todd Rose.
Thanks. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to set things up. I begged them to let me be a part of this, mainly so I can bask in their glow of the things they do. So I just want to set the frame for why I'm excited about what Leap does. And as Phyllis introduced, so I'm a scientist by training, and I am currently the director of the Mind, Brain, and Education program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And my focus has been in a field called the science of the individual, which it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a science that's focused on understanding patterns of individuality, and it's at work in things like genetics and nutrition, cancer research, a whole range of things. And one of the sort of overarching insights from this science is that we've been able to develop new ways of understanding individuals once we figured out something super basic, but it is the absolute failure of group averages to tell you anything about individuals. And this almost seems kind of like a bumper sticker slogan. No one's average, right? But it's actually a deep scientific principle with really practical consequences. And I want to just say briefly, this is my go-to story because it's like my favorite story. Like when we think about how we need to get to this idea of personalized learning, we believe deeply, our approach is that you have to do two things. You actually need a mindset shift, which easy to say, hard to do. But as long as we're willing to see ourselves and each other through the lens of averages and deviation from average, it's simply not possible to use the technology and use what we know about learning to actually personalize. It just isn't possible. And how I feel about it right now is when I look at my colleagues doing, say, cell biology, the idea that there's such thing as an average cell is nonsensical. Like, it's not true. No one really believes that. And so you can develop these insights. But when I say, for example, there's no average person, even people who want to believe that still feel like, well, is that really true? Or is it like, are you saying everyone's above average? Or, it's like we're still grappling with this old way of seeing people. But I will say, just as my go-to example, like we've known that there's like no such thing as average person for quite a while. And the first place where we really figured this out was actually the US Air Force. And so I just want to give you this example. Some of you probably heard it before, but just as a tee up for what we'll talk about with learners. It happens at the dawn of jet-powered aviation after World War II. We went from propeller planes to, again, jet-powered aviation. And we invested so much money in these new planes, and we've assumed, hey, we're just going to get better results, right? Except for you spend all this money, and the Air Force is getting terrible results in terms of performance. Everything from just not good performance all the way to like crashes, fatalities, and stuff like that. And so you read the history of this of thinking of why is this a problem, and it kind of reads like modern day education. First, it was the pilot's fault. They were like, they just don't have the right stuff anymore, right? And then it turns out World War II vets, these aces, were having just as many problems, so it wasn't their fault. Then they blamed the flight instructors. They said, you're not teaching them right. So they invested in like new ways of teaching how to fly. Doesn't change anything. So finally they figure out what the problem is, and it's actually with the cockpit itself. And here's what it was. Since the beginning of military design, all the way back to the Civil War, the guiding philosophy for designing, for scale was to design for the average pilot or average soldier. And so when we designed our first cockpits in 1921, they literally took the average dimensions, average of like 10 dimensions of size of the pilots at the time, and said, okay, design a cockpit for that. With the thinking that like if you designed for those averages, you would create one cockpit that fit most people, right? So that was the design philosophy. And then they realized, hold on, maybe something's wrong. So the first thing they realized in the 40s is maybe we've gotten bigger, so we need a better average. So they decide to undertake the largest study of pilot size in history. And they bring in this one guy, Gilbert Daniels, who wasn't anything remotely close to like the testosterone-drenched Air Force. He was like, he liked flowers and plants. He was like, he goes on later to become the president of the American Horticultural Society. But he gets brought in because he had a background in anthropology, physical anthropology. And they said, okay, you're the guy that's going to go around and measure over 4,000 pilots on 147 dimensions of size. He's got the tape measure. This is his thing. And they said, we just want a better average. Tell us what the average is. So I had the real pleasure for my book to actually, I found him. I thought he had to have been long gone, but he was alive, and he told me all these background stories about, so he's sitting there taking measurements, and he's like, something bothered him. He's like, with this concept of average. And so he asked the generals, he said, look, I think I know what the problem is. It's that I don't think there's actually, like, very many people are average. And they said, well, that's obviously not true, right? Like, by definition, most people are going to be average. And so he says, look, can I just do this simple study? Can I just, of all these 4,000 pilots, can I just find out how many of them actually are average on these, like just 10 dimensions of size for cockpit design? And they're like, you can, but not on our time. Like, that's how we don't think it's worth it. So he decides to take this side study at night and on weekends. And he just does this simple thing. 10 dimensions of size that matter for design. How many pilots of these 4,000, which, by the way, these were white male pilots who were selected because they fit into an average-sized cockpit. How many of them are average on these dimensions? So he's thinking, the generals say, well, obviously most will be. He's thinking it won't be most, but even he's shocked when he runs the numbers and finds 0. There's literally no such thing as an average-sized pilot. And what he found instead, and I think this is really critical, is that when you map out physical dimensions of size, these 10, it's like those dimensions, like being tall doesn't mean you're necessarily heavy or that you have broad shoulders, right? They're not very correlated with each other. So what that means is every single pilot ends up having what we call a jagged profile of size. So because of that, you'd literally be designing a cockpit that fit nobody. And to their everlasting credit, so they're really worried about, okay, we've figured this out. This is not what the generals want to hear. Right? So they say, look, we know what the problem is. The Air Force pivoted on a dime. It's actually pretty remarkable. It takes 2 years before they've literally banned the use of averages in design for cockpits. And of course, the companies that build these planes were like, whoa, 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 right? We only know how to design on average, right? So they tried to lobby Congress. Oh, it'll be too expensive. It's not practical, blah, 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 But the Air Force wouldn't budge. And then as soon as we realized they weren't going to budge, suddenly they could design flexible environments, right? When there's no way out of it. And I'll just say, the reason I want to tell you the story is because sometimes when we think about designing flexible learning environments, it feels overwhelming. And when it came to designing cockpits, it's true. Nowadays, we design fighter jets that accommodate 99.9% of the population with one cockpit, right? To get to that 99.9%, it required like glass wraparound cockpits, things that were hard to figure out. But no kidding, once they started designing to the edges, as we called it, they figured out cockpits planes didn't even have adjustable seats. That's how wedded to the idea of average we were. They didn't have adjustable seats, they didn't have adjustable pedals, and so they implemented those, and they were able to go from accommodating literally like almost no one to accommodating like 80% of the population almost overnight. So in my field, we have a way of thinking about individuality, getting away from averages and rank order to thinking about a principled way to think. And I'll talk about this tomorrow I'm giving a talk on my book. But we have this, and this idea of jaggedness is a core principle. And the way we're trying to affect change on my end is I'm a scientist, and my colleagues and I, we feel like there's two things you have to do if you want to create sustained change toward personalized learning. One is mindset. At the end of the day, again, like cell biologists don't think of average cells, but most of us actually kind of do see ourselves and each other and human potential through the lens of average and deviation from average. If we can't get out over that, we're not going to understand how to use the technology and other things to personalize. But the second thing is, just because you have the mindset, if there are no solutions, if you can't act on the idea, then it's really hard. In fact, you get really frustrated, right? Like now you know better, but you can't do anything about it. So our view is that we've got to catalyze solutions across all these areas of education to allow people to act. But look, the first thing I always get asked is, this sounds great. If I'm a school, a principal, if I'm a superintendent, what would I do tomorrow? Like, even if I buy it, how do I get to personalized learning? Is it everyone's a snowflake and you just, like, how do we do this? The good news is, that's not my job. I'm the ideas person. So what we do is we get to partner with wonderful organizations that really get this and have gone from taking scientific principles to turn it into an applied framework that you can act on. And for my money, there's really nobody better than LEAP at really thinking this through right now. And so super thrilled to be partnering with them to help infuse the science into the things that they do. And so I just wanted to stop there to set this up. But like, I feel like what's needed is the ability to look at frameworks that aren't one size fits all. It's kind of funny how often in personalized learning we still say, and this is how you're going to personalize for everyone, right? But so I think this is a framework that is grounded in science, that I feel very confident in, but has the flexibility and a focus on action and application that will allow us to get to personalization at scale. So I want to stop there and just turn it over to the great folks at LEAP. And thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Todd. You inspire us all. And as Todd mentioned, when we first organized LEAP or launched LEAP, we did a lot of great work developing a framework, a pilot network to bring in education technology to personalized learning. And as Chris and a number of our team members who have great education backgrounds talked about this, unless we change the pedagogical shift of how we're trying to personalize the learning experience for students, the tech isn't going to matter a whole lot. And I think the struggle was that many frameworks are out there. I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of them, but not many have gone into the details to explain the specific teaching and learning practices. What does this look like in the classroom? And a number of our educators who are here from Chicago were asking us that question. So Chris and the team worked for a while to develop kind of this work. What we want to do, though, for fun, which I forgot to mention, was on your tables is an assessment. So we'd like you to do a personal assessment on to what degree, for those of you guys who are in the classroom, are you or your schools personalizing learning? And we've got prizes at the end. So please fill those out as we bring Chris up. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for that and for engaging and meeting some of your neighbors here today. And the PL assessment, or sort of self-assessment you just did, is a very small snapshot when we work with our schools and et cetera. It's a much deeper reflection around it. But it's just to start to unpack, to Todd's point, what are our current practices? And although there's a lot of people saying personalized learning with intent, is it actually getting down to the grass level in the classroom? And is it how we are interacting with our students, with our parents, and with our families? So I want to kind of walk you through the framework and a little bit of where it came from. There are copies there. Obviously, we also have a digital copy online at leaplearningframework.org in case you want to grab it, and happy to share more. But as we got into it, year one at LEAP, everyone was saying personalized learning over and over, and you realize you would get a few weeks into whatever, and although, yeah, you want personalized learning, yeah, you want it right, but philosophically, people weren't completely aligned on what that looked like with the actual interaction and the teaching and learning, and most importantly, the student's experience. And so at LEAP, we spent about a good 6 months digging into this to really try and figure out what are the core elements. Looked at a lot of other frameworks that are out there, and honestly, I helped with some other framework development, and realized we need to start with teachers. Not think tanks, not people kind of pontificating about the future of education, but starting with teachers in the classroom that have been doing this. So we identified some top teachers that had been doing Montessori or project-based learning, basically existing formats to personalize it for their children, and dug in very deeply with them on design sessions on what, when you boil it all down, what's the core aspects of this? And going back to not what you're doing as an adult, but what is the student experience or the learner's experience, which is a huge shift, because there's a lot of stuff in education that's very adult-driven. And with personalized, that's the sort of the magic to it. It's learner-driven. And so you got to get there and say, okay, what does it look like for the kids that I'm working with in front of me? So we went through that, got these core elements, but then we wanted to make sure that it was backed by science. There's a lot of learning science and cognitive psychology, and we didn't just want to have some feel-good strategies, but this is backed up based on how we know people learn. And even at the lunch yesterday, the lady mentioned around maybe Einstein and things of that nature. There's a lot of research out there on how people learn, but we got to translate that to the classroom and how we teach our children. And so that's where the kind of connection with Todd and others came on, okay, when we look through these elements, do these match up with what we know on the neuroscience side? And it was almost amazing how, when we first met Todd, he was just off the top of his head, yeah, we got this, and we got this, and we got this. There were so many connections to people we spoke to on how to kind of make sure this not only is informed by teacher practice, but also informed by how we know people learn. And then finally, just some national leaders. Those are the people that have been in the space of competency-based progression, personalized learning, et cetera, and running it by them and their user experience as well to get to the sort of polished version that you have in front of you. And this is very much a starting point. So every year, we're kind of constantly iterating on it to learn as we move through it and what are the core elements. So the first main bucket is learner-focused. And in this sort of handout, there's also some references to the research behind it. But that gets to the jagged profile, that every person is a unique individual, and you need to really acknowledge that. What that looks like in practice, some of our schools, I'm thinking of Patrick Henry, they did listening conferences with their students. And they would sit down, and it was the student and the parent talking to the teacher for 20, 30 minutes around their likes, their interests, their needs, and et cetera. And that's such a shift in education compared to kid, come on in, take an assessment, here's the one score that represents you. And I got to say, as a parent, I have a 4-year-old, and he took his little pre-assessment thing for the first time this year. And as a parent, to have my child represented by a single number was almost insulting. And it makes you realize when you flip it as an educator and you talk to the students and say, what do you need? And help them get to know themselves so you can get to know them as well. It's a totally different dynamic in the classroom and education. And you can start to learn small things like you might say to a student, there was one who he was always an issue in writing class, behavior issues, things of that nature. In the conversation with him and his parent in the listening conference, he expressed pretty clearly that his confidence in writing is pretty low. He's nervous in that thing, and so he's acting out to try and get out of that. Another situation in which the child would only see his mother maybe once a month. And so as a teacher, if you stop and say, I'm going to call your mother, that doesn't resonate with that child. And so from a learner-focused side, how do you adjust their needs and their context? Also from a universal design for learning, how do you adjust it according to the different ways and methodologies to learn that information? The second one, learner demonstrated, is and Benjamin Bloom's study is pretty famous for this as well, on how much individualized pacing can really change the game. And Sal Khan spoke at LEAP in Chicago a few months ago, and he spoke very well of this on Khan Academy, just how much you'll see kids will kind of plateau as you're kind of struggling, and then you'll hit that sort of thing and then accelerate through. But if you were to like label the kid at the very beginning and tracked them, you never would have seen that hidden potential. So there's a lot around, based on the learner demonstration and giving them some flexibility in time, there's so much unlocked potential that we don't even know about. One of my most memorable experiences when I was working in New Orleans prior to Chicago, we started to move to sort of a competency-based progression. And we were sitting there, and we had some digital curriculum. And we got an email from a company that said, hey, congratulations, Heaven is the student of the month in Louisiana. And we checked, and Heaven was a third grader, but this was our middle school curriculum. And we're like, what's going on here? And as we got into it, we realized she'd basically figured out a login to the middle school math curriculum, went home and just was like going to town on this thing, and accelerated through it. And it wasn't just like a slap in the face to us, it was like a punch in the stomach of how much we had designed things previously that was hiding kids' potential, creating ceilings and barriers for them to grow, when really, when you get that thirst for knowledge and intrinsic motivation, let them get off to the races. I mean, it was a really realization how much the system just doesn't allow them to fly and how much we're holding them back versus you have kids that are ready for it, but how do you design for that and design for the edges so once you're ready to go, make it happen. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges also in terms of school design because we're so used in terms of like cattle herding. You're born in this year, okay, therefore you're going into this room or classroom, and then you move here, and then you move here. And so even in Chicago, we're starting to see more multi-age classrooms and things of that nature that allow that flexibility for pacing and demonstration of the learner and really letting them acknowledge their own potential. And then the last main area I'll address is learner-led, which gets to learner agency. So there was a study out of Urbana-Champaign in which students were able to choose their method of study, and consistently they did better versus being told how to study and the pacing around it. And it's pretty simple. Same thing as adults. If you're told exactly what you do, your motivation isn't going to be there. You're just going to kind of follow it through. And one of my favorite stories, CICF Irving Park mentioned this to me. Solid school, kids were doing great on the tests, but a kid dropped a paper clip in class and walked up to the teacher and said, what do I do with this? Because they were so used to being told what to do by an adult. And they realized we're not creating the sort of life skills for our children for them to be successful. They get into high school and college and 21st century, very much what Michael Moe was speaking about last night at the keynote. And so same thing for a teacher. It's not just content, but you're developing an individual that can advocate for themselves in the real world and very intentionally scaffolding that learner agency and ownership through it. And so at Irving Park now, if you go in the other classrooms, the kids have a lot of choice in terms of space. They have like these cute little exercise bikes, so if like you got to burn it off, go on over and burn it off. And we see it over and over of sort of discipline issues go down dramatically as you start to shift to a place where you basically trust the children. There's a big thing here around trust and realizing I don't have to tell you everything you have to do. I'm going to scaffold it for you. So kindergarten is different than 8th grade, but how do you allow more agency and start to develop that throughout the child's experience? And so as we get into what this looks like in the classroom, the approach for the framework was very much not just like big ideas, but getting it all the way down to the strategies. So we got about 60 look-fors and these core domains. And so you have an element and then suggested strategies. And I want to stress suggested. Because I know as a teacher, you have a lot of strategies and it's do this and do this and do this. For us, there's a huge level of creativity in the profession that you need to maintain. So part of our work is with public, charter, private schools all over the city. It's a very diverse mix of cohort intentionally. And so let's stop and say, okay, if your core element is how do you support learners and getting to know them, their strengths and interests, how you get there as a school and as a teacher is up to you. It's very much of a co-design because what's going to look like in North Side School versus West Side versus even the one down the block, that's going to be different and that's okay. You walk into a Montessori classroom, that'll look different than someone who's very heavy in terms of blended in technology, and that's okay. but we're going back to what's that core element around the student and learning experience that you're going for, and then what are the possible strategies to kind of get you going. And that's very much in the design of the framework, where we wanted to get down to not just big thoughts, but when you show this to me as a teacher, I need to be able to take action tomorrow in my classroom. Or as a principal, I need to be able to talk to my staff about this in a more concrete way. So the strategies are kind of just getting started, and as we continue to learn more, we intend to kind of share more and more through the website and other formats, just to kind of build the community around how people are approaching the work. And then the last piece is not just, let's do it, but how do we continuously improve? So we do a lot of professional development. Every teacher and principal that comes in sees Todd Rose's TED Talk. So they're pretty familiar with the myth of the average and all that. But also teacher observations, and not for evaluation. This is for coaching. This is to get better as a professional. And so the other flip is when we go in and observe a classroom, you're not watching the teacher. You're watching the students. Because we're going back to what is that student and learner's experience. That's what we care about. So don't go in there and just videotape the adult, because we actually piloted a little bit of those video cameras that'll like follow the teacher, and we're like, this isn't helping us at all. What we really care about is what's that child's experience and what does that look like. The other two big parts is American Institutes for Research was a key partner in developing a teacher and student survey around these elements. And you can imagine they're very informative for coaching. As you can talk to a teacher and say, here's what I'm trying to create for my students. And then the students, which they don't lie, here's how I'm feeling. Am I actually able to progress when I'm ready? Do I actually have a sense of agency? And are those true or not? So these surveys allow kind of this 360 view of the classroom to help inform the schools and the teachers and how they evolve over time. So we've done it here in Chicago, and now doing more of it nationally to kind of get some national norms. So same thing, you can kind of get out of your bubble and start to see where do you fall on a larger continuum. And same thing for the strategies. As we continue to find them, when schools are identified with very high learner agency or very high in terms of learner focused, that's where we're going to go deeper in terms of what are some of the strategies happening in that place, so we can just continuously get better along the way. And so overall, for the LEAP learning framework, we really stepped into it to define a learner-centered or personalized learning approach with a deep level of clarity so that teachers and parents, even students, everything, can clearly know what we're shooting for here. Building capacity is also a huge part. And I think we find over and over that a teacher is ready for this. It's more the mind shift. Because so many teachers, our feedback is, this is why I joined the profession, to work with children, to get to know them, to not teach to the middle, but to really tailor it to my kids along the way. So, because we hear it every now and then, like, oh, you work with like 20, 30-year veteran teachers. They probably hate this stuff. And actually, they love it. It's just a matter of giving them the permission to move and shift to that approach to teaching and learning versus always kind of being mandated and teaching to the middle and whatever that looks like. And then finally acknowledging, in a state of humbleness, this is continuous improvement. We got to keep getting better and better. This is an early field that's kind of forming. And so through the combination of our community along with the research to evolve these elements and strategies as we also figure out what's the most effective side to it and share it as well. I think the power of the community is huge for all of our work. So we got coaching, we have tools. The website is leaplearningframework.org, so feel free to check it out and share. We're just getting started. We'll be kind of releasing in the future videos and other things to help make this very concrete and applicable for everyone, along with kind of growing the community that is in this space. So the last thing, with your little self-assessment, if you could add up your total, and as mentioned, we got some prizes. So I'm going to do this like what? You're going to do Q&A first? Yeah. All right, we'll do Q&A first, and then we'll do the prizes.
Awesome.
Right.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
So one of the things I wanted to, before we open up for questions, is to ask both of you, and Chris, from the educator and classroom perspective, Todd, from your research perspective, because you touched on this in your book, around when this notion of trying to do these approaches on the individual level and doing research and work and practice at the individual level is super hard. But we get better results. I mean, you've proved it time and time again, throughout your book. And that the notion of this transition and the fact that we actually have data, much more data now, and the ability with technology, if this is coupled together in an effective way, to truly revolutionize education. Can you both comment on that?
Sure. So again, I'm the ideas person. So it's such a nice place to be. From a science standpoint, there's often this sense that we've kind of gotten, when we take average-based approaches which have defined our entire society, right? Like from our workplace environments to health and wellness, and so education's no different. The reality is this idea of an average person is such an artificial thing, but it's been made to feel natural to us, right? So we've been taught to think this way. So there's a sense that somehow if you let go of that, even when you know it's wrong, that it must be chaos and it must be like, okay, we might be able to do it, but it'll be really complicated. But the reality is, over and over again in the science, when we've agreed to let go of this false reference frame, and we've focused on individuality, time and time again, it actually clarifies and simplifies where average is actually masked and obscured, right? Like it's quite the opposite. And I think for me, it's not that like every kid's a snowflake, although that's probably true, right? It's just not a useful way to think of it. Can't build a science on that. But that if you have a principled way to think about individuality, right? If it's not average and rank, what is it? And then you tie that to like an actual applied framework that has basic elements with a lot of flexibility in how those things are executed on, that's where we get something really interesting. And if you're trying to do it in isolation with a system that's still built around averages, that it feels incredibly difficult, and in fact it really is. So part of what gets me excited is thinking about how we all move together, right? So whether it's the science and this very abstract kind of thinking, so the way we study people, to the way we create databases and the kind of stuff we collect, to the way we design information, to the frameworks we use. I'm really excited about the opportunity as we move together this way, that in fact that kind of approach to change management I think helps to like ramp down the anxiety, and actually I think we can get somewhere.
Yeah, and to the technology piece, I mean, it's like there's no technology in the framework, and that was very intentional because the goal here is not technology. I think someone mentioned yesterday, technology is neutral. The strategies and the tools you use, I mean, sometimes analog or paper-based might even be better than technology. So really grounding it around, here's the experience you're trying to create, and then it'll guide people to when technology is used and adaptability, et cetera, where it makes sense for the aspect of the student experience that they're going for. And I think that was also a big aha for us as we were going through it, because so many things had this assumption that you had to have technology, or personalized and blended learning would be used to mean the same thing, and they're incredibly different.
And by the way, from a technology standpoint, first of all, I love my technology, so I like that. It's just a tool, right? Like, I mean, paper and pencil is technology. So it's like when we confuse those things and we think the technology is a solution, we often get ourselves in trouble. And I think if we step back and think clearly about what is it that we want education to be able to do, and then what is the technology that's available to us, what are its affordances and constraints, then I think we get somewhere. But if we let the technology sort of dictate things, I think it takes us to a completely different place. And for me, what I get really excited about is I think my view of personalization is we can leverage the technology to create really flexible environments, right? The kind of cockpit that fits everyone. And we can create adaptable environments. But those two things, you'll never have technology that will personalize everything. Like you run into what's called the curse of dimensionality in a hurry if you think you're going to embed algorithms that know everything about a kid. This is where I think student agency becomes like really the linchpin aspect of this. If we can teach kids to see themselves this way and how to make choices, and we build a system that actually has the kind of choice architecture and the kind of scaffolding that helps kids do that, I think that's how we're going to get somewhere really special. But I will say that brings with it a whole, you need this different kind of framework to help think about how you move in that direction, because if you want to empower kids to make choices on their own behalf, that's a different system than we have.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I'd like to open up for questions.
Acknowledging your point about technology, are you working with, because what ends up happening is the teacher needs more flexibility to be able to deliver more personalized content to students, which is where we often turn to technology. So are you working with any companies that are doing student learning management that would be a fit for this particular, I think the model's great, but again, we need a delivery vehicle.
Yeah. So with a lot of our work in Chicago, it's sort of school redesign and learning experience redesign. So we work with people through the framework, but then there is a part for our pilots, and then we have kind of a research team as well, what we call match day. So companies apply, we vet against the framework and also efficacy, and then the educators get to choose if there's a good fit. So same thing, kind of empowering the teachers and the principals to go from thousands of products that are out there to here's a short list of things that could align well with what you're trying to attempt. They run pilots for the full school year, because also we find, what it looks like in August is very different than what it looks like in May, as they've been able to really unwrap the tool and evolve their practice. But yeah, in many ways there also is helping to inform companies on what the teachers need to create this type of experience and kind of a positive feedback loop as things get better.
How does learning social skills and working with others play into personalization? Because I think it can be easy to fall into the trap saying a personalized route is just you, but there has to be connections with others. And how is that facilitated?
So we didn't go deep into it, but there's that fourth area of the framework of learner connected, which is very intentional in the design of the framework, coming from the teachers and also from us on. So the question was, how does peer connections and social interactions fit into personalized learning? And learning is social. I'd send my kid to school to interact with human beings and to be a part of that and to be connected to society, and that's also what it looks like. So we stress sort of within all of this, the goal is not an isolated experience, put the kid on headphones and VR and run. That's not what we're going for here. It's how do you have authentic experiences with your projects, how are you working with your peers and collaborating. The learner agency piece, I also find over and over, fosters that in terms of kids being advocates for themselves and then reaching out to peers and them helping each other or parents or things of that nature. So there's sort of an underlying assumption with all of this on how is the learner connected to humans and peers, and even just museums and resources and communities and things of that nature. But that's an excellent point, because that was another big part for us as we got into the work on, you could say, personalize it, crazy algorithm, take them on the computer and go, and that's also not a good way to learn either.
I'll also say one thing that's interesting just from the science standpoint is when we committed to understanding individuality, one of the core principles is what we call the context principle, which we realize you simply cannot understand individual behavior, learning, or development independent of the immediate environment, which is a heavy relational component. And so we find even if we just want to know how Johnny's doing, we have to be able to model Johnny in context, right? With this kind of teacher, with these kind of peers. And again, that seems crazy chaotic, but actually it simplifies. And I think when we take individuality seriously, it paradoxically brings us closer into relationships and other kinds of things, rather than pulling us into isolation.
I did want to note, we are going to build out the learner connected portion of our framework this summer. And the tools that Chris mentioned, the survey tools that we have for educators and students, we've piloted this year across the country. Those tools are going to be available for any of you who want to use them by this fall. And the learner connected, the social piece will be part of, will be more fully, robustly built out with those tools as well.
Great question.
Yes, sir.
So you guys are based in Chicago, and the work you do, I'm assuming, is kind of centered in the Chicago area right now. Thank you. For those of us in other parts of the country that are doing similar work, one, I want to say that you guys are doing fabulous work. I'd love to see a 26-30 in reality across the school, because you know, you look at it and you say, wow, that could happen in a classroom. But to make it effective for all students, I think being able to bring that out across the country would be great. Do you guys have partnerships? Are you guys looking at building those bridges out beyond Chicago?
Yes, absolutely. So we have a number of partnerships. Some of them are represented in this room with Learn Launch in Boston, the Highlander Institute in Rhode Island, Digital Promise, and others through the Gates Foundation's generous support. We're working and partnering with a few other cities to make this available. Any school district or school would like to educator who would like to use this framework or the tools, they're available to you. And we'll run the data for you. And the good news is that we're going to be working with AIR this summer to come up with a national norm, so you can get a sense to what degree you're implementing these practices from an educator standpoint as well as from the student's perspective. And we also believe that this will help better pinpoint what are the professional development needs for the educator. We're also building out a suite of professional development resources, and we're trying to figure out how to deploy those as well. But if any guys want to come to Chicago, we're happy to deliver. We're also thinking about doing webinars as well. So if any of you are interested, please let us know.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is really exciting work. I think a lot of the ways that we measure success, are looking at how did this student perform compared to this hypothetical average fifth grader, or what's the overall average in this particular class, what's the overall average in this grade, what's the average across the school. And so I think for us to really be able to unleash teachers, we have to change the way we're measuring success at the school and at the district level. And I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations on how we can even start to think about that or have those conversations.
I'll let you go. You want to do that?
So I feel like from a system standpoint, it's always this challenge, right? So any one piece, so a teacher says, I got it, I would like to do this, but hold on, I'm actually being measured against this other thing. So there really is, you can't kind of do what you want to do like this, and then you go and talk to the people at the administration and go, well, hold on, we're also beholden to this other. We've created this weird kind of loop where we're all just stuck on this merry-go-round and we can't get off of it, right? We're all, I think that the work in competency-based learning, which is a pretty mature field comparatively, right, for all these things we're doing, I've been really impressed with the work that's gone around thinking about measuring individual growth against competencies rather than normative stuff. And there's some really fabulous groups doing that work. I actually think, we've been trying to think from our perspective of how you push for change. If you tell people there's like 10 things you have to do, that just seems like really overwhelming. So we're trying to find what are the linchpin things where if you got this moving in that direction, if you got the public to demand this, you could get a long way. I actually think competency-based learning, and in higher ed or K-12, it's a much easier sell, right? Do you really care how your kid compares relative to the kid standing next to them? Or do you just want to know, are they developing the competencies that they need? You know, I have 2 kids in college, and I'm paying $50,000 a year per kid, and I don't really, frankly, give a damn what they're great. I want to know, are they developing the skills to get the job that I think I'm investing in them to get, so they can pay for my retirement, right? Like, it's really, and so I feel like once you accept competency, then you realize norm-based, norm-referenced assessments aren't particularly valuable at measuring anything like that. Also, I think that's a way in, and I think there's enough resources and mature things that allow us to act on it pretty quickly.
I have a question for you. How do we support the teacher? For instance, I have an example in my talk of a 5th grade class in Chicago, Illinois. Mm-hmm. 1 student's reading at the 1st grade level, 1 student's reading at the 8th grade level. Mm-hmm. There's only 2 students in the whole class reading at the 5th grade level. For a teacher to be able to, 1, assess the students, mm-hmm. 2, to find the appropriate learning activity that meets each of those students' needs, because if you give you can student be frustrated or a student be bored.
That's right.
It seems to me there's not enough hours in the week for a teacher to do that. So we've got a fundamental flaw in our system that sets up the teacher as a failure.
Yeah.
If, in terms of meeting the individual needs of each student. How do we address that?
We'll come back to Chicago because we have schools that are doing that right now. Chris, you want to share some examples?
Yeah, and I would even say, I mean, on a personal note, I was a teacher for about 8 years and sort of burned out just due to it, because you'd step in every day and you're like, I'm just not set up for success. Because to your point, you'd have an incredible range of skill sets in there. Excuse me. So a lot of the work in Chicago is shifting to these sort of flexible environments. We see a lot of team teaching models, multi-age. So the way I see it is, get the idea of school equals classroom plus 30 kids plus 1 adult. That equation is just not gonna work. So how do you change that equation? And so we see a lot of people, honestly, they take the doors off the hinges and all these kind of things to allow this flexibility so that kids are not grouped based on age, but based on competency. Teachers start to specialize in what they teach. There's then roles of the technology for the diagnostic and assessment. But it really is a lot of like, we're not going to buy iPads and solve the solution here, but we got to rethink the equation of how we teach our children and how we design schools.
Yeah, and this is what I think is interesting, this, the flexible design. So you take something like Universal Design for Learning, you know, Jamie Basham, who's like one of the leaders in this, it's worth looking at as a framework for saying, what are the ways that we can guarantee kids are going to vary naturally in every classroom, everywhere in the world, that could be designed for in advance, that you don't have to wait until the kid gets there and go, wow, they differ in reading ability. Like that's, and the technology can carry that, right? It can offload some of this work to free up the really high value stuff for teachers. I remember, of all the feedback I get from people talking to me about, from talks and books, one person came up to me who had built product, like textbooks, K through 12 textbooks, digital textbooks, and said, wow, we designed 4 grade levels of reading support for every textbook. So if it's a science textbook, it can accommodate 4 age levels. And he's like, we don't even market it because we didn't think it mattered. We knew it was the right thing to do, but we didn't think it would be a selling point. Right? So if we're thinking age-based stuff, it's like, yeah, who cares? Like, so there's a flexibility there, and then the time piece. What I think is important, these two things work hand in hand. Yes, you need more time, but part of that, the amount of time you need is the wasted time that comes from the friction that's created from a bad fit between the individual and the learning environment. So if we're doing these things together, I think we'll get a more efficient system. And I will say, we've done this before. San Francisco Normal School got rid of, in like 1913, got rid of age-based cohorts, created a whole school based around competency, and just crushed it. I mean, like, they were graduating kids like 2 years early, and ultimately, without the public mindset, it always snaps back. Like, people got like freaked out, like, this is not what school's supposed to look like. You know, where are the rows of kids in classrooms? So even when you do it well, if people don't understand what they're looking at, there's such a pull back to the sort of standardized approaches.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. You have 2? Yes.
Hi, I'm Yanira, and I'm from Oakland, California. And I completely agree that we have to rethink just the architecture of school. And something that we're battling with is that it not only requires a switch in mindset for like average going out the door, but also for the job itself for teachers. So I'm wondering what resources you have around the collaborative structures and the rethinking that will need to happen in just the job itself in a flexible grouping where the teachers are deployed.
Yeah, happy to even chat more, and we have some of our Chicago teachers and educators here that have gone through that change, and they're awesome resources and thought partners around it. So yeah, I almost think of it sometimes of like designing a kitchen, like you need to kind of see all these different options, and then you find things that work well for your context, and different strategies for grouping and team teaching. But it is, it's a shift in the profession, because sometimes, I know even at one school I used to teach at, you go in, you close the door, and like you're in your own like world, and you see the principal maybe a couple times a year. And so to shift to this other model, it's, if people are not used to interacting with each other, there's a learning curve there and what that looks like. But we find over and over that suddenly your horizontal and vertical curriculum alignment gets outstandingly stronger because things are not siloed anymore as a school or an institution. and now I know what you're teaching, and I know what we got next year, and that competency kind of progression can build through it. So it ends up being very much a staffing and curriculum design. It's a lot of changes to the profession, but we also find, I think, it's much more sustainable. Like I think people are now, they're not coming in and being like, I got 30 papers to grade, and how am I going to do this, and doing everything on their own. But how is the system and their peers surrounded and built to better serve the kids to move it forward.
Great. Well, I know we're at hour, so prizes. Chris.
Yeah.
You guys have your assessments?
They're puppies, so feel free to.
All right, we'll do this. Since some of it, everyone put your hand up. If you are below 10, put your hand down. If you are below 15, if you are below 20,
If you're cheating,
21, 22,
Chicago people.
23. We got 3?
That's pretty good.
Awesome. We got our 3 winners right there.
Perfect.
Come on
Go
up.
get the
we get
prize.
to
Thanks, everyone. And
Thank you
thanks
again,
to Todd Rose and Chris Liang-Vergara. We'll be here for a few minutes for questions. Thanks, everybody.